Hi, welcome back. In this tutorial we're going to carry on with making our drum kit from the sliced beatbox sample, and we're going to have a look at toms. Now we'll cover this over a couple of tutorials. In the first tutorial we'll just look at making some basic tom sounds, and then in the second tutorial we'll look at mapping some of the key parameters to macros to give us some sound sculpting capabilities and to give us some real-time control over them so we can change them dramatically and use them in a live performance setting as well. But in the first tutorial we're going to just really look at creating fairly simple toms. They're more like synth toms that you might find on some of the older drum machines, possibly even some of the sort of late 70s disco tracks, those kind of very synthetic sounding toms. We're going to start by just copying the kick drum, and we're going to copy it to this row here, and we just drag it and hold Control on PC or Alt on Mac and then rename it high tom. We'll start with the high tom. And the reason we're doing that is because a lot of the basic principles are quite similar to a kick drum. You can really start with a sine wave and a pitch envelope to create a basic synthesized kick sound, and you can sort of do the same with toms. Settings might be a little different, but you can certainly create toms just with a sine wave and a pitch envelope, and then a few other changes. So we're going to do the same here. Basically we're going to use a lot of the same settings that we used with the kick drum. So copying the kick drum is a good place to start. So I'm going to turn off the saturator and compressor here because we're not going to use them at first. I'm going to actually, later on, I'm going to group the three toms together and apply a compressor to all three at once. So to start with, let's just change our little repeating note to our high tom. Now, you can hear that's quite quiet because I turned the compressor and saturator off, but let's just turn that up a bit. So first of all, I'm just going to turn the pitch envelope amount down a little bit to maybe about less than half of what it was there. And I'm going to also change the filter to a low pass 12, turn the resonance down a bit to under about here, and then turn the frequency up a bit. And now we're going to use a filter envelope. And we enable that by pressing this button here. And you can see it makes the envelope amount control and the attack, decay, sustain, release controls available. So we turn the envelope setting up to somewhere between 60 and 70, something like that. Now we'll pull the decay back a bit. Turn it down a bit now because it's made it a bit louder. So you can hear that's given it some real punchiness. It's got a much sharper attack on it now and a bit of a tougher sound like a real tom. But it's very short. And normally we could just go to our volume decay knob here and turn that up a bit. And it sort of extends it a little bit. But it's still a quite short sort of tom sound. And of course we're trying to do the high tom first, so we would probably want it a bit higher, maybe around here. Or even on 0 there. But you notice as we turn the transpose up, it just plays the sample a lot faster. So the decay is a lot less. It's got a lot less length to the sound. That means that we don't have much room to move. It's not going to actually give us a lot of ability to change it much. So the way we're going to get around that is by using the loop settings, and that's going to change the sound quite drastically. So before we do that, I'm going to just copy this tom sound across. Just hold Control on PC or Alt on Mac while you drag. So, and we'll rename this. Let's just stop this playing first. We'll rename this mid tom and low tom. Now of course we can swap these over later on. In fact we'll do that now. You just swap them by dragging like this. But now that'll play the low tom. I'll move that to the high tom because we still want to keep that there. But what I'm going to do now is duplicate that clip. Just get those out of the way. Duplicate that by Control D or Command D on Mac. And in the new clip, I'm going to just copy that note by dragging it and holding Control. Actually, make sure you press Control or Alt on Mac before you drag it, because otherwise it won't work, as you just saw there. And now we've got all three of them repeating, so we can edit all three at once. And so now I'm going to make them different by changing the transpose settings. Now we have all three toms, and they're not bad really, they sound quite good as toms. Just maybe add a little bit of delay and reverb. But as we're about to find out, there are a lot of these settings that I'd like to change that are global for all three of these toms. And there's actually a very handy feature for when working with racks in Live 7, and that is called copy value to siblings, which is in the context menu here. And you can see it tells us how many siblings there are. There's 13 here, but that's not what we want, because we only want these three to be the same. So that will copy the same settings to all the other sounds in this drum rack as well, and we don't want that. So the way to get around that is to just group the three of them together. And so by holding Shift on Mac and PC, we can either right click and choose Group, or we can choose Control G or Command G on Mac. And what that will do is it will create a little nested drum rack within this drum rack. We can now rename toms. We now have a separate drum rack just for the toms. And you can see they still play. We've still got the same pads here because the pads represent the notes, not the actual sounds. So they still work the same there, but the difference is now we can use one send to affect them all. And that sounds pretty good. And also a delay might be useful. Ping pong delay is always good for toms. Might want to turn the feedback down a bit. Now that's quite nice. As I said before, I wanted to actually use a compressor on all three of them. So what I might just do is use one of the ones that's already in these racks, because we originally copied them from the kick drum that had them there already. And I'll just drag that out of this rack. So now that is over all three of them. So we maybe don't need the volume up quite so high now, so I'll turn that down a bit and copy value to siblings so it affects all of them. Now that's sounding pretty good. I'm quite happy with how that's sounding. So you could choose to leave it like that, but basically what we're doing at the moment is we're just using this sample here, which was the original beatbox kick sound, and we're just making that into a tom. But as I said before, if you want to then pitch these up, then it makes it too short, and we don't have any control over the length. So the way to get around that is to use the loop settings here. Then copy value to siblings so it's enabled on all of them. See, that's on for all now. Then I'm going to turn the length right the way down to about 6.5, something like that. I'm going to turn the fade up to around 44. The loop down to maybe 34, something like that, and I'm going to turn the start forward a little bit. Now I'm going to have to copy that across to all the others as well. Now you can hear, actually before I do that, you can hear what's happening there. That loop is just repeating that little tiny bit quickly. And it almost sounds like a pure waveform created by a synthesizer. And if you look at it, that looks not a whole lot different to a sine wave. So in a sense, that's effectively what we're doing. We're just really quickly looping this small section of the sample, and that's kind of treating this as like a single cycle waveform. So whenever you use a synthesizer, you start with a waveform, like a sine wave, square wave, triangle wave, sawtooth wave. And basically the shape of the wave dictates how it will sound when it's looped very, very quickly. Which is basically what we're doing here with the simpler. We're using the simpler as a synthesizer, and just by using a tiny little loop of this audio file here, as though it was a single cycle waveform. So if we just copy these parameters now using the copy value to siblings, now they should all be the same. Now we're going to need to change the pitch envelope again. Bit more than that. Turn that down a bit as well. Now we might want to pull this back a bit. Now it's a bit high now, so I might pull it down a bit. I'm going to pull all of them down. Might turn that reverb off for the moment. Too much. So you can hear there much more, that's much more synthy now. That's more like you kind of a synth tom. We can play around with these settings a lot more, but I'm not going to for the moment, because in the next tutorial we're going to actually map a lot of these functions to a macro, to this macro here. And that's going to give us the option of playing them in real time. So there's not much point in getting too picky with these sounds just at this stage, because we're going to really change them quite a lot in the next tutorial. So we'll leave it there, and make sure you check out that next tutorial. Thanks for watching. See you next time.